I should have never agreed to take that job. When they first called me about the construction project up in Alaska, I thought it was just another high-paying gig. I'd been working on projects in remote areas before, but nothing like this. They said the job site was isolated, a few hours from the nearest town, tucked deep into the Alaskan wilderness. That alone should have been a red flag. I'm Jake Collins, and I've been a construction worker for 15 years. I've seen my share of odd things. Creepy old buildings, strange sounds, and some real weirdos along the way. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I arrived in the wilds of Alaska. I arrived in the town of Gana, the closest place to our worksite. The small, real small, just a handful of buildings, no real stores, just a few local spots where the people gather. No one was particularly friendly, but they weren't rude either. Just distant. I remember when I tried to ask a guy at the gas station about the area, he didn't make eye contact, just gave me a vague answer. Stay close to the camp. That's all you need to know. That night, I stayed in a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. The lights in the hallway flickered, the rooms smelled of mildew, and the bed creaked like it had seen better days, but it was all I could afford. The wind outside howled through the trees, like some kind of animal crying in the night, and I couldn't sleep. Something about the place felt wrong. But the worst part was the man who appeared outside my window. It was about 3 a.m. I'd finally managed to drift into a restless sleep when a shadow passed in front of the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing a branch or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again, clearer this time. The figure, tall, thin, moving slow and deliberate. I froze. I couldn't make out much, just a silhouette, but it wasn't normal. It wasn't the wind or an animal. This thing had purpose. I didn't want to make a sound, but I knew I had to check. I got up, my heart pounding, and crept toward the window. There was no way I was opening it. God only knows what was out there, but I had to look. I slowly pulled back the curtain, just enough to peek through. And then I saw it. The figure was standing there, staring up at my window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the outline of his features. They were wrong. His eyes were too wide, his posture too stiff, like he hadn't moved in hours. He just stood there in the cold, watching. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at him, but the moment felt like hours. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I didn't want to take my eyes off him, but I couldn't help it. Something pulled my gaze down, and I noticed something on the ground in front of the motel room door. A footprint. A large, deep print in the snow. But there was something strange about it. It didn't look like a human's. The shape was too wide, and the depth of the imprint suggested something heavy, too heavy. It was like something massive had stood there for hours, watching. Before I could process what I was seeing, the figure at the window slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I never slept. I just stared at the door, too afraid to move, listening for any sound, anything that might give away what was lurking just beyond the light. In the morning, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the fatigue of travel getting to me. But that's when the others started talking. The next day, I was supposed to head out to the worksite. I hadn't spoken to anyone about what I saw that night. I wasn't sure if I even believed it myself. But when I got to the site, everything felt wrong from the start. The crew was small, about 5 of us. I met Mark, the foreman, a gruff guy who looked like he'd been working in the wilderness for years. He didn't seem fazed by the isolation at all. The others were quiet too, just like the locals in town. There was Tom, a burly guy who didn't say much, and Mike, who kept to himself, always looking over his shoulder like he was expecting something to appear out of the trees. But it was Jim who caught my attention. Jim was new just like me. He had a wild look in his eyes, like he hadn't seen daylight in months, and he kept nervously glancing at the trees, as if something or someone was watching. We set up camp near a small clearing where the construction was supposed to take place. The place was desolate, no nearby homes, no towns. Just a never-ending forest of spruce and fir trees, stretching for miles in every direction. The first thing Mark said was strange. "Whatever you do, don't go off the path. Stay close to the camp and you'll be fine. The woods here, They don't like strangers. At first, I thought it was just his way of scaring us, but the more time I spent there, the more I realized he wasn't joking. I didn't think much of it until the first night. That evening, Jim came to me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Jake, something's out there," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to be lurking behind him. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to play it cool, though my heart was racing. I had no intention of acting like a scared rookie on my first day, but the fear in his voice was contagious. "I've been hearing things," Jim said, his voice trembling. "I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I heard something out there. The trees, they move. The wind doesn't blow like it should. And there's this thing." He trailed off, and I could see the fear in his eyes. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe he was just rattled by the isolation. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, the sound of something moving in the woods. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, a moose maybe, or a bear. But as the sound grew closer, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't the usual rustling of trees or animals. It was deliberate, a slow, dragging sound, as if something heavy was moving through the brush, something too big to be a bear. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding, not daring to look outside. It sounded like it was circling the camp, moving from one side to the other, taking its time. I knew the others were awake too, because I could hear their breathing, the occasional shuffling in their tents. No one was saying anything, but we were all listening, waiting for the thing to show itself. Then suddenly the sound stopped, just like that, and for a moment, there was complete silence. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. The silence felt wrong, like the air was thick with something that wasn't supposed to be there. And then it came. A knock at my tent door. I froze. My mind raced. Who could it be? Mark? Mike? It was too late for anyone to be out there. The knock came again, this time harder, louder, and I could hear the faintest whisper, like someone was calling my name. "Jake, come outside." I didn't move, couldn't. The last thing I wanted to do was open the tent. But the whisper didn't stop. It was coming from outside the tent, just inches away from where I was lying. It was so clear. "Jake!" I had no idea how long I stayed like that. Frozen, my mind screaming at me to move, but my body too terrified to respond. Eventually, the whispering stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to check. The fear that washed over me felt like a wave, crashing and crashing, over and over. The next morning, when I finally dared to step outside, there was no sign of anyone, or anything, being near my tent. But I noticed something odd. The snow. Where I had heard the noise, there were deep, wide impressions in the snow, as if something massive had been circling the camp. But there was no trace of an animal. Nothing I recognized. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to seem like I was losing it, but I could see it in the eyes of the others. They knew. They'd heard it too. That day, things got worse. By the third day, the camp had changed. It wasn't just the eerie sounds we kept hearing at night or the strange occurrences. Something in the air had shifted. There was a tension, an unspoken understanding among the crew. No one talked about it, but everyone knew something was wrong. It was as if the forest was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jim wasn't the same. He was growing more paranoid, and his fear was contagious. He refused to leave his tent unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, his eyes would dart around constantly. He wouldn't even speak to anyone, only muttering to himself under his breath. It was Mike who first mentioned something I couldn't ignore. Late in the afternoon, when the sun was setting behind the mountains, he pulled me aside, his face grim. "You don't believe Jim, do you?" he asked quietly, looking over his shoulder like he was afraid someone would overhear. I shrugged. "I don't know, man. It's hard to say. I heard something out there, but it's probably just animals." Mike shook his head, his lips tight. "It's not animals. I've been up here before, years ago. I heard the stories. There's something in these woods. Something old. They say the natives used to talk about it. Something they called the Watcher." I didn't know what to say to that. The Watcher? It sounded like some urban legend. But Mike wasn't the type to joke about stuff like this. Before I could respond, there was a scream. A short, sharp sound that ripped through the air. Came from Jim's tent. I bolted toward it with Mike right behind me. When we reached Jim's tent, it was already empty. The flap hanging open. The air inside cold and still. "Jim!" I shouted, but there was no answer. The others came running, but we found nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign of Jim at all. Mark looked around, his eyes narrowing. "He must have run off," he said, his voice low. "He couldn't handle it. He's gone crazy." But I knew that wasn't right. Jim wasn't the kind of guy to just run off into the wilderness by himself, especially not after what happened the night before. And if he had, he wouldn't have left his gear behind, his boots still inside the tent. The forest was silent as we searched. The air felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on us. We looked for hours, calling his name, but there was no trace. It was like the forest had swallowed him whole. That night, we all stayed inside our tents. No one dared to leave. The whispers outside returned. Quiet at first, then growing louder, moving around the camp like an invisible force. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same dragging sound I had heard on the first night. This time, it was much closer. It circled the camp, slow and deliberate. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble with each step, as if something massive was moving just beyond the trees. I lay there, heart racing, trying to control my breathing. The sound stopped right outside my tent, and I could hear a soft rustling, as if something was sniffing the air. Then the whispering began. "Jake! Jake!" I gripped my flashlight, my knuckles white, and slowly, I unzipped the flap of my tent just enough to peek out. There, just on the edge of the campfire's glow, was a figure standing still. I could see the outline of it, tall and thin, its head tilted back unnaturally, almost like it was sniffing the air, listening for something. And then, to my horror, it moved toward the fire. It wasn't human. The shape was all wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was stumbling with each step. And I realized it wasn't walking. It was dragging itself across the snow, pulling itself along with long, claw-like fingers that left deep ruts in the ground. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. My entire body was frozen in place. The creature reached the fire and stopped, staring at the flames. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me, even from this distance. They burned like coals, glowing red in the darkness. Then it spoke. "Jake?" It rasped. The voice wasn't human, more like a rasping whisper, like dry leaves scraping against each other. "Come closer." Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything in me screamed to run, to get as far away as possible, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own terror. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing turned and melted into the trees, vanishing like smoke in the night. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. The air felt colder now, as if something had changed, something irreversible. I waited, not daring to move, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. But I knew one thing for sure: whatever it was no animal. It wasn't from this world. The next morning, we were a shell of what we once were. Jim was gone, and so was any sense of safety we had left. The forest had claimed him, and now it was coming for us all. By the fourth day, we had no choice but to leave. Mark tried to convince us to stay, to finish the job, but none of us could ignore what was happening anymore. Jim was gone, and something far worse than we ever imagined was lurking in the wilderness, watching us, waiting. I don't think any of us had the nerve to speak up at first. But then Mike, he was always the practical one, the guy who kept a level head, finally broke the silence. He stood up at the fire, looking around at all of us, his eyes full of a cold resolve. "We're not staying here," Mike said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tremble beneath it. "We pack up and we get the hell out of here now. If we don't, we're next." There was a moment of hesitation. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. None of us wanted to admit it, but we knew Mike was right. The thing that had come for Jim, the thing that circled the camp every night, it wasn't just a bear or a moose. It was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent. We started packing up in silence, each of us moving mechanically, doing what needed to be done without speaking. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The forest felt closer, tighter, like it was squeezing in on us, unwilling to let us go. I could hear branches snapping in the distance, and I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something watching us. When we were ready, we set out. But the thing that haunted us the most wasn't just the fear of what might be lurking in the shadows. It was the knowledge that we weren't alone. As we made our way through the dense forest, we stayed close, each of us looking over our shoulders, listening for the sound of something or someone moving behind us. The trees loomed over us, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching down, blocking out the sky. There was no sound, no birds, no animals, just the oppressive silence of the wilderness, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig beneath our boots. And then, just as we crossed a narrow ridge, I heard it, a low guttural growl. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Mike was the first to react. He grabbed my arm, pulling me forward, urging us all to move faster. We have to get out of here, now. We broke into a run, our feet pounding against the snow and dirt, but the growl followed us. It was closer now, too close. The sound of something large moving through the trees, too fast to be natural. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, just in time to see the outline of something massive emerging from the shadows. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its body was distorted, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. It had long, spindly arms, its hands clawing at the air, and its face, God, its face was the worst part. Its skin was stretched too tight over its skull, pale as bone, and its eyes, they were nothing like anything I've ever seen. They were hollow, black as night, with no whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything from this world. Mike yelled, pulling me away, but I was frozen. We were all frozen. I could feel it coming closer, could hear its breath, rasping, ragged, like it was starving. It stepped forward, dragging one long leg after another, its eyes never leaving us. Then Mark, who had been ahead of us, stopped. He looked back at us, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then he turned, running straight into the creature's path. I didn't understand. He was sacrificing himself. He had seen something in that moment, something I couldn't even fathom, and he knew that running wouldn't save us. The creature didn't waste any time. It moved toward him with impossible speed, its limbs stretching like rubber. The sound of bones cracking filled the air as it grabbed Mark, pulling him into the shadows with a scream that still echoes in my mind. We didn't wait. We ran, all of us, as fast as we could. But I knew deep down, that it wasn't just Mark it wanted. We were all going to be hunted. It had marked us, one by one, and there was no way out. We reached the edge of the forest just as night fell. The trees gave way to the barren wasteland that surrounded the town of Gana. The town, small as it was our only hope, the only place left to run. But as I turned back to look at the forest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The creature was standing at the tree line, its figure barely visible in the darkness, watching us, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, just stood there, waiting. We made it back to Gana, barely alive, our bodies shaking with exhaustion and terror. But even as we stumbled through the door of the nearest cabin, I knew it wasn't over. The creature wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and it would never stop. We barely slept that night. In the small cabin, we huddled together, staring out the windows, each of us too terrified to even move. It was the kind of fear that eats at you from the inside out, knowing that what we had seen, what had chased us, wasn't a nightmare or a hallucination. It was real. As the hours passed, we heard the sounds again, the growling, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't just the wind, it wasn't just the night creatures. No, it was something else. Something larger, something that wasn't going to let us go. The sound echoed through the trees like a warning. Mike, who had been so calm in the face of everything, was now pacing, his hands clenched into fists. He had his rifle with him, but it didn't seem to offer him much comfort. None of us spoke. What was there to say? The creature had Mark, and we knew it wasn't satisfied yet. It wouldn't stop hunting us. Not until it had every last one of us. By morning, I could see it in their faces, the hopelessness, the acceptance. We were never going to be safe again. The creature had already chosen us, and there was no escaping that fate. I don't know why I didn't feel the same way. Maybe I was in denial, but there was a part of me that still believed we could get out of this. But Mike wasn't so sure anymore. He was the first to speak, his voice hollow. "We have to leave Alaska. We can't stay here. It won't stop. It never stops." I knew he was right. I knew the creature was still out there, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something inside me, some deep primal instinct, told me we couldn't just run away. It would follow us wherever we went. So I made a decision. We're not leaving. Not yet. The others stared at me, incredulous, as if I had just lost my mind. But I couldn't explain it. Something told me that if we didn't face it now, we'd never be free. We couldn't let it take over our lives, our every waking thought. We couldn't live in fear any longer. We spent the day preparing. We knew we had to confront whatever was hunting us, no matter the cost. We weren't sure how, but we had to try. I went into town and picked up whatever supplies I could find. Weapons, fire starters, anything to give us a fighting chance. I even found some old hunting traps in a dusty shop, thinking they might help us catch whatever it was. Mike, though, had no faith in that. He just wanted to leave, but I could see in his eyes that he was afraid, too. Afraid of what we might find. Afraid of the creature and the endless terror that came with it. When nightfall came, we returned to the woods, every nerve in my body screaming to turn back. But we didn't. We couldn't. We gathered by the edge of the forest, hoping, praying that if we could just get close enough, we might catch a glimpse of it. Maybe even fight it off. We didn't have long to wait. The growling came first, distant at first, then closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The ground beneath us seemed to vibrate as if the earth itself was alive, as if it could feel the creature's presence moving through the woods. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to the others. We all held our breath, waiting. Then it appeared. It came from the trees, dragging itself slowly toward us, its long arms swinging like a spider's legs, its black eyes burning in the darkness. The air grew cold, suffocating, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. It was real. It was here. We raised our weapons, though I knew deep down that it wouldn't be enough. None of us were ready for this thing. It didn't seem to care that we were armed. It moved like it wasn't bound by the rules of nature. It was something else, something ancient. Mike fired first. The shot rang out through the night, echoing off the trees. But it didn't stop. The creature barely flinched. In fact, it seemed to move faster, angrier. Its mouth opened wide, and the sound that came from it, if you could even call it a sound, was like a deep, gurgling growl mixed with a scream. It was enough to paralyze you. We kept firing, but it was no use. The creature didn't feel pain. It didn't care. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it stopped. It tilted its head, staring at us with those soulless eyes, and it spoke. Again in that dry, rasping voice, like a whisper on the wind. "Not yet," it hissed. "You can't escape." And then it was gone. Just like that. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. It was over, but I knew it wasn't. The creature was still out there, and it wasn't finished with us. We left the forest that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following us. It wasn't done. It would never be done. And somehow, in the back of my mind, I knew this was just the beginning. We thought we had escaped. The days that followed felt like a fragile illusion of safety. We returned to Gana, but no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves that we were out of the creature's reach, deep down we knew the truth. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be until it had taken what it wanted. The nights grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as though the darkness was alive, waiting for us to let our guard down. We spent most of our time inside, too scared to venture far, but the fear wasn't just from what had happened. It was from the feeling that something was closing in on us, that the Watcher was drawing us back into its grip. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. We had all seen it, the way he sacrificed himself, running straight into the creature's path without hesitation. There was no way it was just a random act of fear. Mark had known something. Something about the creature, something about this place. Maybe he had felt its presence before, maybe even heard the stories from the locals. But now he was gone, and all we had were questions and regrets. But there was something else. I started hearing whispers again. Low, indistinct voices, just on the edge of my hearing. They came in the dead of night, faint at first, but growing louder. Every time I tried to make out the words, they slipped away, as if they didn't want to be heard. And then I started seeing things. Flashes in the corner of my eye, shapes moving just beyond the reach of the streetlights. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the stress and fear finally taking their toll. But then I realized, it wasn't just me. Mike saw it too. So did Tom. Even the townspeople started to act strange, as though they were avoiding our eyes, too afraid to meet our gaze for more than a moment. The tension in Gana was palpable. The silence was suffocating. No one dared to talk openly about the creature, but everyone knew. They knew we had brought something with us, something dark, and they were too afraid to confront it. But it wasn't just the town. It was the land itself. One evening, I found myself walking alone, trying to clear my head. I'd been hearing the whispers again, even more clearly now, and I needed to know what they meant. The sounds were coming from the edge of the town, from the outskirts where the forest began. I knew I shouldn't go, but something pulled me there, like a string tied to my chest. As I reached the edge of the woods, the air changed. The temperature dropped instantly, and the whispers grew louder, clearer. I felt like I was being pulled into the forest, drawn by some invisible force. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart raced as I stepped closer. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a figure standing in the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. I thought it was one of the townsfolk, maybe a hunter or a wanderer. But then the figure moved, not like a human. Its arms stretched unnaturally long, the fingers twisting like tree branches. And when it turned toward me, I saw its face. It was the Watcher. Its eyes, those hollow, endless eyes, burned through me, locking me in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature's face was stretched too tight, its skin thin and translucent, like it wasn't even meant to exist in this world. It opened its mouth, and I heard that same dry whisper, "Jake, it's time to come home." Before I could react, it was gone. In an instant, vanishing into the trees like smoke in the wind. I ran back to the town, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the creature didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It was already inside my mind, its presence gnawing at me, reminding me that it was always watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the cabin, wondering if it was only a matter of time before the Watcher came for me, or for all of us. But it wasn't just the creature I was afraid of anymore. It was the whispers. They had started again, and they weren't just in my head. They were in the air. I could feel them all around me, and I knew that no matter where we went, no matter how far we ran, the Watcher would find us. It would never let us go. It would haunt us until the very end. That morning, we gathered in the town square. Mike, Tom, and I stood there, staring at the quiet streets, wondering what to do next. The others in the town had already gone into hiding, closing their doors and windows, staying inside as if they knew what was coming. And then, from the woods, came the sound. It was the same growl we had heard before, low and guttural, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. The Watcher was coming, and this time it was coming for all of us. We couldn't run anymore. By the time the sun set that evening, we were all gathered in the town's small community center. The town had already emptied out, the few remaining locals too terrified to even glance out their windows. They knew what was coming, and they wanted no part of it. Mike, Tom, and I sat in the center of the room, staring at the door, waiting for the inevitable. "Do you think it'll just kill us?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. He had been quiet for most of the day, his eyes hollow, like he'd already given up. I didn't know how to answer. Every instinct told me that it wasn't just after our lives. No, the Watcher wanted something more. It wanted to break us, tear us apart, mentally and physically, until there was nothing left. But I couldn't explain that to Tom. I could barely understand it myself. The town was silent, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it came. A thud. A low, heavy noise that echoed through the walls of the community center, shaking the building. It was followed by another, and then another. The Watcher was here. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The others did the same, their eyes wide with fear, but none of us moved. We were paralyzed. We knew that running wouldn't save us anymore. It wasn't just a creature. It was a force of nature that we had no hope of defeating. The thuds grew louder, closer. The doors rattled, the windows shook. Then came the whispers, faint at first but growing louder. They didn't just come from outside. They were coming from within the room, from the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. "Jake, Tom, Mike." The voice rasped, dry and cold, like the rustle of dead leaves. My skin crawled as I realized the truth. It was already inside. The Watcher had found a way in. I turned to Mike, my eyes wide with panic. He had his rifle with him, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We were all thinking the same thing. It wasn't the rifle or the traps or anything we could do that would stop this. The creature had no weaknesses, no way to fight it. Tom's voice cracked through the silence. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait to die." But there was nothing we could do. The doors burst open with a deafening crash, and the Watcher stepped into the room. His presence was overwhelming. The air grew cold, the shadows stretching, twisting, as though the room itself was warping around the creature. It wasn't just tall anymore. It was huge, massive, filling the space as though it were made of darkness itself. Its long limbs reached out, its claws scraping the floor as it took a step forward. Couldn't breathe. My heart raced in my chest as it locked eyes with me, those hollow, black eyes. The whispers came again, but now they were clear, speaking directly to us. "You shouldn't have come." I felt a pressure in my chest, a weight on my very soul, like the creature was reaching into my mind, pulling at the deepest fears and regrets I had. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. "Please," Tom gasped, dropping to his knees. "Don't kill us. Please." The Watcher tilted its head, its form shifting and stretching like it was enjoying the torment it was causing. Its mouth opened wide, too wide, and I saw the endless darkness inside. It wasn't a mouth. It was an abyss, a black hole that seemed to suck all light into it. "No," it said, and its voice was like 1,000 nails scraping against metal. "I'm not here to kill you." We didn't understand at first. We were too terrified to ask what it meant. But then it laughed, if you could call it that. A dry, gurgling sound that made my stomach turn. "You belong to me now," the creature rasped, its eyes burning like coals. "You're part of the forest, part of the darkness, and now you'll never escape." The room spun. I felt a cold hand gripping my chest, squeezing my heart, pulling me into the darkness. I couldn't see anymore, just shadows, swirling, pulling me down. I knew then what Mark had felt. It wasn't death the Watcher had wanted. It was our souls, our very essence. It didn't just take lives. It consumed us, turned us into part of the wilderness itself, a permanent part of the darkness that would never let us go. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the woods. The trees were alive, moving, whispering to me. I could hear the others, Mike, Tom, screaming, but their voices were fading into the silence of the forest. and I realized, with a bone-deep chill, that I was no longer me. I was just a shadow, just a piece of the forest's eternal, restless hunger. It has been years since that night. Years since we left Gulkana, since the creature, the Watcher, dragged us into its eternal hunger. But the memories, they don't fade. They never do. I still feel the weight of its eyes on me, burning through my soul, pulling me down into the abyss. The town is empty now, abandoned. No one dares to live there anymore, and for good reason. The people who once called Gulkana home are gone, swallowed up by the wilderness. The forests have claimed them as they always claimed those before. But that's not what I want to tell you. I need to warn you. You see, the Watcher doesn't just live in the Alaskan wilds. It's more than that. It's not confined to the forests or the darkness. No, it's a part of everything, a part of the land itself. I know this because, even now, I feel its presence. Its whispers are always with me, beneath the surface of my thoughts, in the corners of my mind. It speaks to me when the night is still, when the wind howls through the trees, and I can hear its call. It's waiting for others, for those who are foolish enough to wander too close to its domain. It whispers to them the way it whispered to me. I know this because I've seen them, the ones who hear the call and venture into the forest, thinking they can outsmart it, thinking they can escape. But there is no escape. Not for them. Not for anyone. I've watched them from the edge of the trees, these new wanderers. I've seen their eyes widen as they feel the cold hand of fear grip their hearts. I've heard their screams, distant and helpless, carried on the wind. And then, silence. The forest always claims them. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I can hear the whispers of their souls, calling out, just like we did. Just like I did years ago before the Watcher took me. I wonder, sometimes, if it's really me who's calling, or if it's just the echo of what I used to be. And it's waiting, just waiting for more. So, let this be a warning. If you ever find yourself near Gulkana, near the edge of the wilderness, don't listen to the whispers. Don't follow the shadows. Because the Watcher doesn't just claim your life, it claims your soul, and it will never let you go. It's always watching, and it's always hungry. They think it's over, but it's never over. The Watcher's legacy is in the land. In the very soil, the trees, the mountains. It's always there. A creeping shadow that cannot be erased. And now, after everything that's happened, I know the truth. It's not just about the forest. It's not even just about the people it takes. It's about the land itself. I've been haunted by the Watcher for years now. Even after all these years of being far from Gulkana, I still feel its presence. Its eyes, its whispers. It's always with me, always calling me back. And for a long time, I thought I was just a survivor, that I had escaped. But I was wrong. I wasn't a survivor. I was a part of it. The Watcher doesn't just claim your soul. It marks you. It brands you with its cursed touch. And no matter where you go, no matter how far you run, it will follow. I started noticing it again a few months ago. Small things. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then, I started hearing it in my dreams even when I woke up. It was as if the Watcher had never really left. And the whispers, they weren't just in my head anymore. They were in the world around me. When I walked outside at night, I could hear the leaves rustling with its voice. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, just waiting for me to acknowledge it. That's when I decided to return. Not to Gulkana, I couldn't. The town was a graveyard now, abandoned and empty. But I needed to go back to where it all began, to the woods themselves. The place where the Watcher had first laid its claim. I didn't tell anyone. Couldn't. There was no one left to tell, really. But I knew that I had to face it one last time. The Watcher was calling me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Maybe, just maybe, if I could confront it, if I could understand its true nature, I might find a way to end this madness. I arrived at the edge of the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon. The familiar chill in the air settled around me, the very air feeling heavier than it ever had before. The trees loomed in front of me, dark and silent, as though they were waiting for me to take the first step. And so I did. I stepped into the woods, and as I did, I heard it. The growl. Low, distant at first, but growing louder with every step I took. The Watcher was there, and it was more than just a creature. It was the forest. It was the land itself, entwined with its essence. It had become part of this place, and I realized then that I wasn't going to defeat it. Couldn't. It was not a monster you could kill with a weapon. It was a force, a part of nature that had taken root in this earth and was never going to let go. I reached the center of the forest, the place where Mark had disappeared, where the first whispers had started. The air was thick, the shadows deep, and I knew, deep down, that this was where it would all end. And that's when I saw it. The Watcher was no longer just a shadow in the trees. It was standing before me, but this time it wasn't just the twisted, long-limbed thing I had seen before. It was more. It was the forest, the trees, the earth itself, all shifting together, forming its body. Its eyes were countless, burning red, glowing from within the trees, watching me. The trees seemed to move, their branches stretching toward me like fingers. I had no more fear, not in the way I used to. It was as if the Watcher had already consumed that part of me. Now all I felt was the weight of inevitability. I had come here to confront it, to stop it, but it was never going to end. Not for me and not for anyone else. "You should have stayed away," the Watcher whispered, the sound of its voice merging with the rustling of the leaves. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was just fact. I had come to face it, but there was no facing it. The Watcher was everywhere. Smiled, or at least I think it smiled. Its face stretched unnaturally wide, a grin that felt like it was pulling the entire world into its mouth. "There's no escape," it said softly. "Not for you. Not for anyone. You are the forest now, and the forest is forever." I turned to run, but it was too late. The forest closed in around me. The trees shifted, the ground trembled, and I felt myself being drawn into it, pulled deeper into the very earth itself. The Watcher's grip was tightening, its presence everywhere, consuming me as it had consumed so many others before. And then, just as I thought I could no longer breathe, I was falling into the darkness. I woke up in a place I couldn't recognize. The trees were twisted and gnarled, the sky dark and oppressive, and the ground beneath me was soft and damp. I couldn't tell if I was dead or alive, but I knew one thing for sure. The Watcher wasn't finished. It had claimed me, and now I was part of the forest, an eternal, restless part of the darkness. The Watcher's legacy would never end, and neither would mine. It's been years. I don't even know how many. Time doesn't work the same here, in the place where I've been drawn into the Watcher's eternal grasp. Here, I am both alive and dead, both trapped and free, depending on the whisper of the wind or the crack of a branch. I am part of the forest now, a lost soul among countless others. The Watcher has claimed me, but I know its hunger is never truly sated. I've learned something in my time here, something I didn't understand before. The Watcher is not just an entity. It is the land itself, a force older than the trees, older than the mountains that rise around me. It is not merely a predator stalking its prey, but a timeless being that consumes, transforms, and grows. It feeds on fear, on souls, on the essence of those who dare to walk the path of the unknown. And I am now one of its many lost souls bound to the earth, bound to the dark. I have seen others since I arrived, the ones who foolishly wander into this place, thinking they can survive, thinking they can outrun the terror. I watch them as they make their way through the forest, their eyes wide with panic, their hearts racing. They are unaware of what they are walking into, unaware that the Watcher is already in their minds, twisting their thoughts, pulling them closer to its grasp. Sometimes I try to warn them. I try to reach out to them in whispers, to tell them that they cannot escape, that the forest is alive and that the Watcher is always watching. But it's too late. It's always too late. The trees block their path. The whispers guide them deeper into the darkness. And then, just as they begin to realize the truth, just as they begin to understand what is happening, it's over. The Watcher claims them. They are never seen again. I can still hear their screams, distant but clear, echoing through the trees. Their voices are like mine now, lost, fading, becoming part of the Watcher's endless hunger. And yet, I still have a shred of my humanity, a lingering piece of my soul that whispers through the darkness, telling me that it doesn't have to be this way. But it's all in vain. There is no escape. There was never an escape. I was foolish to think I could face it, to think I could stop it. The Watcher doesn't stop. It never does. It doesn't care about the lives it takes. It doesn't care about the souls it consumes. It only cares about growing, about spreading, about claiming the land and everything on it. And now I am part of it, forever. As the years pass, the forest continues to expand, reaching out toward new victims. The whispers will always call them in. The trees will always bend toward them. The Watcher will never cease its hunger. It will always be there, always waiting for the next one to step into its domain, to offer itself willingly or unknowingly to the ancient force that lurks in the shadows. And I will remain here, watching, forever a part of the darkness. So if you ever find yourself near Gana, near the edge of the Alaskan wilderness, listen closely. If you hear the whispers in the wind, if you feel the chill in the air, if you see the shadows moving just beyond the trees, know this: the Watcher is waiting. And it is always hungry,